Baghdad, Iraq. The sun had not yet risen over the Tigris when the first Abrams tanks crossed the berm. It was 4:17 in the morning, local time, on the 1st of June 2026, when the United States Central Command launched what military planners would later describe as the most concentrated ground offensive in the Middle East since the fall of Saddam Hussein. Within 48 hours, two of Iraq's most storied cities, Baghdad, the ancient capital of caliphs, and Basra, the oil-rich port city of the south, had been seized, shattered, and draped in the smoke of a conflict that had been building for years. The official death toll, as of the filing of this report, stands at 48,000, a number that military analysts warn may double as field assessments are completed in the coming days. The road to war. How it came to this. To understand what happened on June 1st and 2nd, 2026, one must understand the 18 months that preceded it. In January of 2025, a coordinated rocket and drone strike attributed to the Iranian-backed umbrella network known as the Islamic Resistance in Iraq, a loose coalition of Shia militias operating under the political and logistical sponsorship of Tehran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, struck the U.S. military advisory compound at al-Assad Air Base in western Anbar province. 23 American soldiers died in that attack. It was the deadliest single strike on U.S. forces in the region in over a decade. The American response was swift, but, in the estimation of many hawkish voices in Washington, insufficient. Precision airstrikes were launched against militia command nodes in Deir ez-Zor, Syria, and against weapons depots in Iraq's Nineveh province. Several senior militia commanders were killed. Tehran condemned the strikes. The Iraqi government, fragile and fractured between pro-Iranian and pro-Western factions, issued a diplomatic protest. The cycle, it seemed, would continue as it always had. Action, reaction, a return to the slow burn. But the slow burn was accelerating. Throughout 2025, militia attacks on U.S. positions in Iraq and Syria intensified. A second major strike in April killed 11. A third, in September, destroyed 2 UH-60 Blackhawks on the ground at Erbil, killing their crews. In October, a suicide drone, a precise Iranian-manufactured Shahed variant, struck a convoy outside Fallujah, killing a 2-star general, Major General David Caruso of the 1st Armored Division. That death changed the political calculus in Washington in ways that no amount of diplomatic calculation could contain. By November 2025, the National Security Council had authorized the preparation of operational plans for what would be designated Operation Iron Meridian, a full-scale ground offensive aimed not merely at punishing the militias, but at dismantling their infrastructure in Iraq entirely. The plan called for the seizure of key urban terrain, the destruction of militia command and control networks, and the forced disarmament or destruction of an estimated 85,000 to 120,000 militia fighters dispersed across Iraq's central and southern provinces. Congress was briefed in closed session in December. The authorization for use of military force passed along largely partisan lines in February 2026, but passed nonetheless. Diplomatic backchannels to Tehran, brokered through Omani intermediaries, collapsed in March when Iran's supreme leader publicly announced that any American military action on Iraqi soil would be considered an act of war against the Iranian nation itself, and that the resistance would respond accordingly. By April, the U.S. had quietly moved the 3rd Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, and the 1st Marine Division into Kuwait, Jordan, and northern Saudi Arabia, respectively. A carrier strike group, centered on the USS Gerald R. Ford, was repositioned in the Persian Gulf. A second group, built around the USS Nimitz, took station in the Red Sea. Special Operations Forces had been infiltrating Iraq for weeks, conducting reconnaissance, establishing safe houses, and in some cases, quietly eliminating high-value targets whose deaths would otherwise have raised alarms. The world watched. The world waited. Journalists filed stories about the buildup. Diplomats issued warnings. The United Nations Security Council convened an emergency session. Russia and China vetoed a resolution calling for American restraint. On May 31st, 2026, at 11:59 p.m. local time in Baghdad, the last American diplomatic personnel were evacuated from the U.S. Embassy in the Green Zone. 67 minutes later, the first Abrams tanks crossed the berm. At 3:30 a.m. on June 1st, U.S. Cyber Command and elements of the National Security Agency executed a coordinated electronic warfare package that, within 11 minutes, had degraded or destroyed an estimated 70% of the militia's command and control communications network across central and southern Iraq. Cell towers known to serve as relay nodes for militia encrypted communications were electronically jammed. Satellite uplinks at 3 key coordination centers, one in the Sadr City district of Baghdad, one in the city of Kut, and one in Basra's Al-Jumhuriyah neighborhood, were physically struck by precision munitions at exactly 3:41 a.m. before the ground assault began. Simultaneously, a wave of B-2 Spirit stealth bombers operating from Diego Garcia and F-35 strike packages launched from the USS Gerald R. Ford struck over 200 pre-designated militia targets across Iraq. Arms caches exploded. Command bunkers were reduced to craters. Fuel depots burned with a ferocity that could be seen from 30 kilometers away. In the southern marshlands, a traditional sanctuary for militia forces, a series of bunker-busting GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators obliterated hardened underground facilities that Iranian engineers had spent 3 years constructing. By 4 a.m., the skies over Baghdad were a theater of fire and contrail. At 4:17 a.m., the ground war began. The main assault on Baghdad came from 3 directions simultaneously. The 3rd Infantry Division's 1st Brigade combat team crossed from Jordan through western Iraq along the Highway 10 corridor, moving at speed toward the city's western approaches. The 2nd Brigade moved from Kuwait along the Highway 1 axis, the same road American forces had traveled in 2003, driving hard toward the southern suburbs. The 82nd Airborne executed a combat parachute insertion onto Baghdad International Airport at 4:45 a.m., seizing the facility in a sharp, bloody 40-minute firefight that killed approximately 340 militia fighters and cost the paratroopers 17 dead and 61 wounded. The airport seizure was critical. It established a forward logistics node within the city's western perimeter and denied the militias a potential resupply hub. Within 3 hours of its capture, C-17s were landing with additional ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. In Basra, the 1st Marine Division crossed from Kuwait in a simultaneous assault, moving up the Shatt al-Arab waterway corridor, while Marine Expeditionary Unit assets launched amphibious landings on the river's eastern bank. Naval gunfire from destroyers operating in the northern Persian Gulf, USS Arleigh Burke and USS Dewey, hammered militia positions in Basra's port district, sending columns of black smoke high into the pre-dawn sky. It was like the city was breathing fire, said Corporal James Wakefield, a Marine rifleman from the 5th Marine Regiment, speaking to this correspondent from a field hospital outside Basra 3 days later, his left arm bandaged from elbow to shoulder. Every building in the port district, every warehouse, they'd turned them all into fighting positions. We knew it was going to be bad. We didn't know it was going to be that bad. The Battle of Sadr City. If there was a single district whose name will define the Battle of Baghdad in the historical record, it is Sadr City. The sprawling northeastern neighborhood, home to nearly 2 million of Baghdad's poorest residents and for decades the political and paramilitary heartland of Shia militia power in the capital, had been fortified over the preceding months with a thoroughness that American intelligence had partially documented, but, as subsequent after-action reviews would acknowledge, significantly underestimated. Buildings had been pre-rigged with explosives, streets had been narrowed with concrete barriers to channel armored vehicles into kill zones, tunnel networks extended beneath entire city blocks. Rocket-propelled grenade teams had been pre-positioned in upper floors with interlocking fields of fire. Anti-tank missile teams equipped with Iranian-supplied Dehlavia missiles, a domestically produced variant of the Russian Kornet system, had been embedded in hardened positions throughout the district. The 3rd Infantry Division's 3rd Brigade combat team, tasked with the reduction of Sadr City, entered the district at approximately 7 a.m. on June 1st, supported by Bradley fighting vehicles, M1A2 SEP V3 Abrams tanks, and overhead close air support from AH-64 Apache gunships. What followed would last for nearly 22 continuous hours. "They let us come in," said Captain Rachel O'Gundamu, an armor officer with the 64th Armor Regiment, who commanded a company of Abrams tanks in the initial assault. The first few blocks were almost quiet, and then it was like a switch flipped. Every window opened up at once. The militia forces in Sadr City, estimated by post-battle assessments at between 12,000 and 15,000 fighters, fought with a ferocity and discipline that surprised many U.S. commanders. These were not the irregulars of previous engagements. They were organized into company and battalion-sized formations, equipped with night vision optics, encrypted handheld radios, and an array of sophisticated anti-armor weaponry. Many wore plate carriers and Kevlar helmets. Many had been trained in the assessment of CENTCOM's intelligence directorate by IRGC Quds Force advisors over a period of years. The Dehlavia missiles were particularly devastating. In the first 3 hours of fighting in Sadr City alone, 11 Abrams tanks were struck and disabled. 3 were destroyed outright. 14 soldiers were killed in their vehicles. The sight of burning American armor in the streets of Baghdad, streamed live before communications could be managed on social media platforms, sent shockwaves through Washington and the global press corps. "We adapted," Captain Ogundamu said, her voice flat with the exhaustion of a soldier who has seen things that cannot be unseen. "You adapt or you die. We started using the engineers to breach through building walls instead of moving down streets. We called in air on anything that fired a cornet. It slowed us down. It cost us men, but we kept moving." By noon, on June 1st, U.S. forces had pushed through the southern third of Sadr City. By 6 p.m., the central districts had been largely cleared, block by bloody block. By 2 a.m. on June 2nd, after 22 hours of continuous combat, the last organized militia resistance in Sadr City had been broken. Several thousand fighters had been killed. Several thousand more had fled north toward the outer suburbs, or gone to ground in civilian buildings, initiating the complex and dangerous process of urban clearance that would continue for days afterward. The cost to U.S. forces in Sadr City alone was reported at 312 killed and over 900 wounded, the bloodiest single-district battle for American arms since Fallujah in 2004. Basra. The port burns. While Baghdad bled, Basra burned. The port city at the mouth of the Shat al-Arab is Iraq's second city, and its economic jugular, the terminus of the country's oil export infrastructure, a city of cranes and tankers and oil-stained riverbanks. It is also, for the militias, a city of enormous strategic and symbolic importance. Losing Basra would mean losing not only a military stronghold, but a primary channel through which Iranian weapons, funds, and personnel had flowed into Iraq for years. The militias defending Basra had chosen a different strategy from those in Baghdad. Rather than attempting to hold the city's interior in a static defense, the Basra militia commanders, led, according to American intelligence assessments, by a senior Quds Force officer operating under a pseudonym, had organized the city for a fighting withdrawal designed to inflict maximum casualties on advancing forces, while preserving the core of their fighting strength for a protracted insurgency. The Marines entering Basra from the south and southeast encountered a layered defense of extraordinary depth. Every kilometer of advance was contested. IEDs, some of them enormous, vehicle-borne or buried deep beneath road surfaces, destroyed vehicles and killed Marines throughout the day of June 1st. Snipers operated from rooftops and minaret towers, targeting officers and NCOs with systematic precision. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, described the situation as his men pushed into Basra's oil refinery district in the early afternoon of June 1st. We had contact on 3 sides simultaneously for most of the afternoon. The IEDs were unlike anything we'd dealt with before. Some of them were command detonated from over a kilometer away, and they were targeting the 2nd or 3rd vehicle in a column, not the 1st. Somebody taught them that, somebody with real experience. The reference was pointed. American commanders consistently noted throughout the Basra fighting that the defensive tactics they encountered bore the hallmarks of professional military training, not the improvised techniques of an independent insurgency, but the doctrinal methods of a state military establishment that had been systematically transferred to proxy forces over a long period. Naval gunfire proved decisive in several critical moments in Basra. When a Marine battalion was briefly encircled in the Al-Ashar district near the old Ottoman quarter, 5-inch guns from 2 destroyers offshore delivered suppressive fire within 200 meters of friendly positions, an extraordinarily tight margin that demonstrated both the precision of modern naval artillery and the desperation of the situation on the ground. By the evening of June 1st, the northern half of Basra remained in militia hands. The Marines held the south and the riverbanks. Between them, the city's commercial center burned, its streets littered with the wreckage of both militia pickup trucks and Marine vehicles, its civilians huddled in basements and bomb shelters, listening to the thunder of an urban war that had come to their doorstep without mercy or announcement. The decisive moment in Basra came at 3:15 a.m. on June 2nd. In the pre-dawn darkness, a task force of Special Operations Forces, elements of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, supported by a Ranger Company and ISR assets from the Joint Special Operations Command, executed a helicopter assault on the Central Militia Command Complex in Basra's Al-Qibla district. The complex, a fortified compound built within and around a former government ministry building, had been identified as the primary coordination node for all militia forces in southern Iraq. The assault lasted 41 minutes. When it was over, 14 senior militia commanders were dead, including the Quds Force officer known as General Hassan Shirazi, later identified by the Pentagon as Brigadier General Qasem Mohammadi of Iran's IRGC, operating under a false identity. His death was a decapitating blow. Without coordinated command, the militia forces in Basra's northern districts began to fragment. Some continued fighting in isolated pockets. Many began to withdraw northward and eastward toward the Iranian border. By midday on June 2nd, organized militia resistance in Basra had effectively collapsed. The city was declared secure at 2:47 p.m. on June 2nd. The weight of numbers, 48,000 horned, dead. The figure of 48,000 dead demands examination, not as an abstraction, but as a weight to be carried. Of those dead, American military officials confirmed that approximately 1,847 are U.S. service members killed in action during the 48-hour operation. Another 5,200 have been wounded, of whom approximately 800 are assessed as critically so. These figures represent the largest American combat casualties in a single operation since the Korean War, and they have landed in Washington with the force of a physical blow. The remainder of the dead, roughly 46,000, are a more complicated count. Approximately 28,000 to 32,000 are assessed as militia combatants killed in action. fighters of the Islamic resistance in Iraq and affiliated groups. This number, derived from battlefield surveys, is acknowledged by U.S. officials to carry a significant margin of error. Many bodies remain under rubble. Many fighters were killed in positions that have not yet been fully assessed. The true figure of militia dead may, some analysts suggest, be considerably higher. The most painful portion of the toll, and the most politically explosive, is the civilian dead. The United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq, in a preliminary statement issued on June the 2nd, estimated that between 12,000 and 16,000 Iraqi civilians had been killed in the fighting. The figure was described as preliminary and likely to rise. The majority of civilian deaths occurred in Sadr City and in Basra's commercial districts, where the density of the fighting and the militia practice of operating from within residential buildings, using civilian infrastructure as cover and concealment, made distinction between combatant and non-combatant, a challenge that technology and doctrine could not fully resolve. These are not faceless numbers. They are Fatima al-Jabri, a schoolteacher in Sadr City, killed when the apartment building she sheltered in collapsed under the weight of an airstrike targeting a militia command node on the floor above. They are Ahmed Karimi, a retired civil engineer from Basra, killed by shrapnel while trying to reach a hospital to find medicine for his diabetic wife. They are 73 children whose bodies were recovered from a shelter in the Al-Ashar district of Basra after a militia vehicle loaded with explosives detonated prematurely on the street outside. War does not discriminate with the tidiness that communiques suggest. Iran's response, the edge of the abyss. Throughout the 48 hours of the ground offensive, the world held its breath not merely for what was happening inside Iraq, but for what might happen outside it. Iran's response to the offensive was, in the estimation of most analysts, more measured than Tehran's pre-war rhetoric had suggested it would be. There was no direct Iranian military intervention. No IRGC regular units crossed the border in force. No Iranian ballistic missiles were launched against U.S. bases in Kuwait or Qatar. There were, however, actions that tested the outer boundaries of Iranian restraint. Iranian-backed Houthi forces in Yemen launched a coordinated drone and missile attack on U.S. and allied shipping in the Red Sea at approximately 6:00 a.m. on June 1st, sinking one commercial vessel and damaging a U.S. Navy destroyer, the USS Gonzales, which suffered structural damage to its superstructure and casualties of 4 dead and 19 wounded. The attack was presented by Iranian state media as an independent Houthi action. American officials described it as a coordinated Iranian proxy response and responded with airstrikes on Houthi infrastructure within hours. In Lebanon, Hezbollah, the most powerful of Iran's proxy forces, fired a barrage of rockets into northern Israel, triggering a sharp Israeli air response. The exchange remained below the threshold of full-scale war, but the region's other conflicts flickered with renewed heat. And at the Strait of Hormuz, 3 Iranian fast attack boats briefly harassed a U.S. Navy-guided missile cruiser, the USS Chancellorsville, in what the Pentagon described as deliberate provocations falling short of armed attack. The boats were warned off. No shots were fired. But the incident underscored how thin the margin between a managed crisis and a regional war had become. In Washington, the National Security Council met in continuous session throughout the 48 hours of the offensive. The question of Iranian escalation dominated every meeting. Deterrence was holding barely, and everyone in those rooms knew it. There is a version of this where we're managing a contained operation in Iraq, a senior administration official told this correspondent, speaking on strict condition of anonymity on the evening of June 2nd. And there is a version of this where we're at war with Iran. Right now, we're in the first version. How long that lasts depends on decisions that are being made in Tehran tonight, not Washington. The view from the rubble. On the morning of June 2nd, as the guns in Basra fell briefly quiet, this correspondent drove with a military escort through the southern districts of the city that had been cleared the day before. Buildings stood open-faced, their fronts blown off by blast waves, their interiors exposed to the sky like dolls' houses. Cars had been compressed by the weight of collapsed walls into unrecognizable metallic sculptures. The smell, acrid, chemical with an undercurrent of something that should not be named in print, settled at the back of the throat and refused to leave. Flies moved in thick clouds over debris that concealed what it concealed. A mosque, its minaret snapped at the midpoint and fallen diagonally across the street, had been converted during the fighting into a militia firing position. The prayer rugs inside were stiff with blood. A group of elderly men sat outside a partially destroyed tea house, staring at nothing in particular. One of them, a man of perhaps 75 who gave his name as Abu Hassan, watched our convoy pass with eyes that communicated nothing, not hatred, not relief, not despair. Just a profound and weathered exhaustion, the look of a man who has lived through more historical catastrophes than any person should be required to absorb. The military objectives of Operation Iron Meridian, as defined by CENTCOM's operational plan, have been substantially achieved within the stated time frame. Baghdad and Basra are in U.S. and Allied hands. The organized command and control infrastructure of the Islamic resistance in Iraq has been shattered. Dozens of senior militia commanders are dead. The weapons depots and logistics networks that sustained militia operations across central and southern Iraq have been largely destroyed. And yet experienced observers of this region know, with a certainty born of bitter history, that military victory and lasting stability are not synonyms. The militias have not been destroyed. They have been dispersed. Thousands of fighters have melted back into the civilian population of Iraq's cities and countryside, to be reconstituted, rearmed, and reactivated on a timeline set in Tehran. The political structures in Baghdad that gave the militias their legitimacy, their seats in parliament, their ministerial portfolios, their economic enterprises, remain largely intact. The social conditions that made militia recruitment easy, unemployment, sectarian grievance, the memory of humiliation, have not been altered by 48 hours of artillery fire. The Iraqi government, such as it is, faces a crisis of legitimacy that the offensive has deepened rather than resolved. Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi al-Suri, in a televised address on the evening of June 2nd, that was simultaneously one of the most politically difficult speeches any Iraqi leader has been required to give, condemned the militia violence that invited this catastrophe, while also condemning the unilateral military action of a foreign power on Iraqi soil. The balance he attempted to strike satisfied no one and will likely satisfy no one in the weeks ahead. Among the Shia community, which makes up roughly 60% of Iraq's population, and from which the militia movement draws its primary base, the grief over militia dead and over civilian dead will not be resolved by American press conferences. The images of burning buildings in Sadr city, of weeping women in Basra's rubble, are already being harvested and broadcast by Iranian state media, by militia-affiliated social media networks, and by the full apparatus of a narrative counteroffensive that Tehran was prepared to launch even as its proxy's military power was being dismantled. "We won the battle," said a senior Special Forces officer who had been operating in Iraq for months before the offensive began, and who spoke to this correspondent with a weariness that went beyond simple physical exhaustion. "We've won battles before. Ask me in 5 years whether we won." The soldiers. War. In the accounting of history, wars tend to be reduced to their strategies and their outcomes. The men and women who fight them resist that reduction, not always consciously, but in the way that experience resists abstraction. Sergeant First Class Dominique Tran, a 3rd Infantry Division NCO who fought through 14 straight hours in Sadr City, described sitting against a bullet-scarred wall at around 11 p.m. on June 1st, waiting for his unit to push forward again, eating a cold MRE and thinking about his daughter, who had turned 4 years old the week before he deployed. He had a photograph of her in the pocket of his body armor. He had looked at it several times that day, in the brief intervals between contact. "You don't think about the big stuff in the middle of it," he said. "You don't think about Iran or politics or whether this was the right call or not. You think about your guys. You think about the guy to your left and the guy to your right. You think about getting through the next block. The big stuff, somebody else gets paid to think about that." He paused, picking at the label on his water bottle. "The big stuff finds you later," he said. "Usually about 3 a.m, when you're home and it's quiet and you start remembering." Private First Class Yusuf al-Rashidi, an American soldier of Iraqi descent, born in Detroit to parents who had fled Iraq in the 1990s, fought as a fireteam member in the 82nd Airborne's assault on Baghdad International Airport. He was 22 years old. His grandparents were buried in a cemetery in Baghdad's al-Haq district. As his unit secured the airport in the pre-dawn hours of June 1st, he was aware, with the complexity of feeling that defies easy description, that he was on the soil his family had fled, fighting other people who claimed to speak for that soil in a war that his country had decided was necessary. "I don't know what I feel about it," he said quietly, looking out over the airport's tarmac as C-17s roared in with resupply. "I don't think I'm supposed to know yet. Maybe I'll know in 20 years. Maybe I won't." Conclusion. The history we are making. Baghdad has been taken before, by the Mongols in 1258, by the Ottomans in 1534, by the British in 1917, by American forces in 2003. Each time, the conquerors believed, or said they believed, that they were bringing an end to chaos, a beginning to order. Each time the city absorbed the conquest, buried its dead, and resumed its ancient embattled existence. Basra, too, knows the weight of foreign armies. Its streets have seen Persian and Arab and British and American boots. It has been a battlefield and a market and a symbol and a wound. It endures because cities like Basra, old, layered, resilient, full of the compressed memory of centuries, are constitutionally incapable of not enduring. What Operation Iron Meridian has achieved in the cold assessment of military metrics is significant. The Islamic resistance in Iraq has suffered a catastrophic blow to its operational capacity. Iranian influence in Iraq has been set back by an indeterminate but substantial measure. The immediate threat to American forces and interests in Iraq has been reduced, at least for now. What it has not achieved, and what no 48-hour military operation can achieve, is the deeper resolution of the forces that made this war possible. The competition between American and Iranian power across the Middle East, the fractures within Iraqi society, the grievances of populations who have been caught between foreign ambitions for a generation, the cycle of violence and retaliation that has operated in this region with the persistence of a natural law. 48,000 people are dead. The ruins of Sadr City still smoke as this article is filed. In Basra, families search for the missing in hospitals and rubble piles. In Arlington and in cities across America, families are receiving notifications that will break them open. And in Tehran, in the corridors of the IRGC and the offices of the Supreme Leader, new plans are being made.